During the winter of 1965, an unusual and tense situation developed in New York City's harbor. A French military ship docked there, not for a friendly visit nor to declare hostilities, but to execute a financial operation that would rattle the foundations of international economics. The vessel had come to retrieve gold, vast quantities of pure gold bullion worth hundreds of millions. This wasn't theft. This was a withdrawal from a bank. However, the account holder wasn't an anxious individual queuing at a neighborhood branch. The account holder was the French Republic. The financial institution was the United States of America. Within the White House, President Lyndon Johnson was enraged. Reports suggest he referred to French President Charles de Gaulle as an unappreciative elderly statesman. He perceived this action as treachery, a betrayal from an ally America had freed merely 2 decades prior. Meanwhile, in Paris, Charles de Gaulle remained composed at the Élysée Palace. He didn't view himself as disloyal. He considered himself a truth-teller. He felt he was the sole global leader courageous enough to expose the reality that the emperor wore no clothes, or more precisely, that America possessed insufficient gold reserves. This incident, referred to as the Gold Conflict, marked the beginning of the post-World War II economic system's deterioration. It represented the moment when the guarantee that the American dollar equaled gold was challenged and proven inadequate. To comprehend why France deployed naval vessels to challenge the American dollar, we must return to the origins. We must revisit a conference facility in New Hampshire during 1944. The narrative commences at Bretton Woods. As the Second World War neared its conclusion, Allied powers convened to establish how the global economy would function after hostilities ceased. Their objectives included preventing another Great Depression and ensuring stability. America possessed all the advantages. At that juncture, the United States maintained the sole operational industrial capacity remaining on the planet. It commanded the most powerful military forces, and critically, it controlled 2/3 of the world's gold supply. American representatives proposed a framework that appeared rational at the time. They suggested making the American dollar the cornerstone of the system. All other currencies, the French franc, British pound, German mark, would be linked to the dollar, while the dollar would be anchored to gold at a fixed exchange rate of $35 per ounce. The system was ingenious. It provided global confidence. Possessing an American dollar anywhere worldwide, from Tokyo to Rio de Janeiro, meant holding more than paper. It represented a redeemable certificate. Theoretically, one could enter the American Treasury and exchange that paper for precious yellow metal. America pledged to convert dollars into gold upon request for any central bank. It was essentially the gold standard, but with American intermediation. For 2 decades, this arrangement functioned exceptionally well. It powered the most remarkable economic expansion in human civilization. Europe reconstructed itself from devastation. Japan emerged from ruins. International trade flourished across oceans. The dollar reigned supreme, and demand for it was universal. However, the system contained a defect, a critical weakness that only a handful of economists and one determined French general foresaw. The flaw involved elementary mathematics. As global commerce expanded, nations required increasing quantities of dollars for transactions. To satisfy this demand, America needed to print additional dollars. This worked adequately, provided the United States maintained sufficient gold reserves as backing. But by the 1960s, America was producing dollars far more rapidly than it was extracting gold from mines. The printing operations ran continuously to finance the Cold War, to fund military installations in Germany and Japan, to provide assistance to developing countries, and most costly of all, to finance an escalating conflict in Vietnam's jungles and an extensive domestic welfare program called the Great Society. America behaved like a prosperous individual distributing checks to everyone encountered. Recipients accepted these checks believing in his wealth. But if everyone attempted to cash those checks simultaneously, they would discover the account held insufficient funds. This is where Charles de Gaulle enters the narrative. De Gaulle was a towering historical figure. He had commanded the Free French forces against Nazi Germany. He possessed immense pride and profound distrust of what he termed the Anglo-Saxon powers, meaning America and Britain. De Gaulle maintained that a nation lacking complete independence wasn't truly a nation. He despised France's dependence on America for defense or economic matters. During the early 1960s, his financial advisors presented him with troubling statistics. They demonstrated that America was experiencing a massive balance of payments deficit. They explained that American corporations were acquiring French enterprises, Ford purchasing French automobile manufacturers, IBM taking control of French computing companies. Yet they were buying these tangible assets with paper dollars created from nothing. De Gaulle was incensed. He labeled this the exorbitant privilege. He contended that America possessed a capability no other nation enjoyed. If France wished to purchase petroleum or steel, it needed to earn dollars by selling wine or automobiles. It had to labor for its currency. But if America wanted to acquire something, it simply printed additional green paper. It represented a complementary meal on a planetary scale. De Gaulle perceived this not merely as inequitable economic competition, but as a form of domination. He believed America was conquering the world not through military force, but through monetary inflation. The critical moment arrived in 1965. America was intensifying the Vietnam conflict. The expenditure was staggering. The Federal Reserve was injecting money into the financial system to maintain low interest rates and economic growth. Inflation was beginning to increase. De Gaulle recognized that the American dollar was fundamentally overvalued. It traded at $35 per ounce of gold, yet so many dollars circulated that the actual value was considerably lower. He understood that America was essentially insolvent regarding gold. It had promised to provide gold for every dollar, yet it had issued far more claims than it possessed assets. It constituted the world's largest fraudulent scheme, and de Gaulle determined it was time to withdraw his investment. He didn't act discreetly. De Gaulle excelled at political drama. On February 4th, 1965, he convened a press conference at the Élysée Palace. The chamber was filled with journalists from across the globe. De Gaulle sat beneath crystal chandeliers wearing his military uniform. He spoke in his characteristic slow, resonant voice. He delivered an address on monetary history. He informed the world that gold was the only authentic currency. He stated, "Gold possesses no nationality. It is eternally and universally accepted. It is unalterable and trustworthy." He proclaimed that the era of dollar supremacy had concluded. He announced that henceforth, France would no longer accept ambiguous promises from America. France would exercise its rights under the Bretton Woods Agreement. It would take its reserves of American dollars, hundreds of millions, and return them to the American Treasury, demanding gold in exchange. This declaration sent shockwaves throughout the financial world. It constituted a declaration of economic warfare. De Gaulle was essentially challenging America's position. He was alerting everyone to danger in a crowded space. He understood that if other nations followed France's example, American gold reserves would disappear within days. Washington's reaction combined disbelief and alarm. President Johnson attempted to minimize the threat. He dispatched diplomats to Paris to dissuade de Gaulle. They argued this would destabilize the West. They claimed it would benefit the Soviet Union. They appealed to the friendship between the two nations. But de Gaulle remained unmoved. He famously remarked that treaties resemble young women in roses. They endure while they endure. The era of dollar dominance had passed. The French government initiated the transfer logistics. This wasn't a digital transaction with numbers moving across screens. This was 1965. It was a physical operation. The Bank of France assembled pallets of American dollar bills. They notified the Federal Reserve of their redemption intentions. America had no legal alternative but to comply. Refusal would admit the dollar was worthless, causing the entire global financial system to collapse immediately. Therefore, the American Treasury opened the vaults at Fort Knox in the New York Federal Reserve. They began loading heavy gold bars onto trucks. These bars were standard delivery bars, 400 ounces of pure 24-karat gold. They were transported to the docks and loaded onto ships. It's a striking image to envision. In an era of nuclear submarines and jet aircraft, the fate of the global economy depended on heavy metal crates moving slowly across the Atlantic Ocean. The French Navy participated to ensure shipment security. This represented France's national wealth being repatriated. De Gaulle wanted the gold in Paris, in the Bank of France vaults where he could physically verify it. He didn't trust Americans to store it. He believed possession was the only principle that mattered. As initial gold shipments reached French ports, American media turned against France. They boycotted French wine. They poured champagne into gutters. They called the French ungrateful. But de Gaulle didn't care about popularity. He cared about reality. And the reality was that American gold reserves were rapidly depleting. In 1945, America held 20,000 tons of gold. By 1965, that quantity had dropped significantly. Now, with France extracting substantial amounts monthly, the depletion was accelerating. Other nations began observing nervously. Germany, Japan, and Spain all maintained massive American dollar reserves. They were loyal American allies, dependent on American military protection. They feared angering Washington, but they also feared being the last ones holding worthless assets. If France claimed all the valuable assets, what would remain for them? A quiet bank run commenced. Central banks began covertly exchanging their dollars for gold, attempting to avoid creating a scene like de Gaulle, but trying to protect themselves nonetheless. The pressure on the London gold pool, a mechanism Western nations used to suppress gold prices, became unbearable. The market price of gold wanted to rise, but the American government was selling gold to maintain it at $35. They were depleting reserves to maintain an illusion. De Gaulle's attack wasn't solely about economics. It was a geopolitical maneuver. He wanted to break American dominance over Europe. He wanted Europe to be independent, a third power center in the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. He viewed the dollar as the chain binding Europe to American foreign policy. By breaking the dollar, he hoped to liberate Europe. He was particularly critical of the Vietnam War. He believed the war was unjust and destined to fail. He argued that Europe was indirectly financing the bombing of Vietnam because America printed money to pay for the bombs, and Europe absorbed that inflation by holding the dollars. By demanding gold, he was effectively defunding the American military apparatus. Tension escalated throughout the late 1960s. The American government attempted everything to stop the depletion. They imposed capital controls, preventing American citizens from investing abroad. They tried to discourage tourism to keep dollars domestic. They pressured allies like Germany to sign agreements promising not to convert their dollars for gold. The German chancellor famously received correspondence from America threatening to withdraw American troops from Germany if they redeemed their dollars. It was essentially a protection arrangement. We'll defend you from the Soviets, but you must hold our depreciating currency. Germany capitulated. France did not. By 1968, the situation was critical. America had lost more than half its gold reserves since World War II's conclusion. The vaults were emptying at an alarming rate. The French had successfully repatriated tons of gold. The American public was growing anxious. There was discussion of a dollar crisis. Import prices were rising. The inflation de Gaulle had warned about was arriving in American cities. The initial phase of de Gaulle's strategy had succeeded perfectly. He had exposed the dollar's weakness. He had proven the emperor wore no clothes. He had transferred physical wealth from New York to Paris. But he had also unleashed forces he couldn't control. He had ignited a fire that would eventually consume the entire Bretton Woods structure. The system was fracturing. The market sensed vulnerability. Speculators were gathering. And in the White House, a new president was preparing to assume office. Richard Nixon was observing the gold drain with a cold, calculating perspective. He understood the situation was untenable. He knew America couldn't continue paying gold indefinitely. He realized he would need to choose between preserving the dollar's reputation or saving the American economy. And unlike previous diplomats, Nixon wasn't afraid to overturn the entire arrangement. The stage was set for the final collapse. The ships had departed. The gold was in Paris. Dollars were flooding back to America, causing inflation. The trap de Gaulle had set was tightening around the American economy. But Americans had one final strategy. A strategy that would transform the nature of money itself forever. De Gaulle wanted a return to the gold standard. He wanted honest currency. But America was about to give the world something entirely different. They were about to sever the connection between money and reality completely. The gold conflict was about to transform into a Fiat revolution. By summer 1971, the financial conflict Charles de Gaulle had initiated with his press conference 6 years earlier had reached a critical point. The physical gold transfer from America to France had depleted the American Treasury. The images of French ships loaded with bullion departing New York were a humiliation the American superpower could no longer tolerate. But de Gaulle's bold gamble had accomplished more than embarrassing Americans. It had triggered a global confidence crisis. The secret was revealed. America didn't possess sufficient gold to cover its obligations. The bank run was no longer exclusively a French operation. It had become global. In London, the British government was quietly panicking. They observed the same statistics the French had seen. The British ambassador approached the American Treasury with a polite yet devastating request. They wanted to convert $3 billion of their reserves into gold. They wanted to do this quietly to avoid panic, but the sheer magnitude of the request was the final straw. It equaled approximately 1/3 of remaining American gold stock. If America paid the British, almost nothing would remain. The Fort Knox vault would be essentially empty. The American dollar, which was the foundation of global commerce, would be revealed as worthless paper. Richard Nixon was now America's president. Nixon wasn't someone who cared deeply about economic theory. He cared about power, and he cared about winning the next election. He examined the situation and saw a trap. If he continued following Bretton Woods rules, America would go bankrupt. He would need to induce a massive domestic recession to stop inflation. He would need to cut Vietnam War spending. He would need to cut social programs. It would be political suicide. Nixon realized America was being constrained by the very system it had created. The promise to pay gold was a chain around the American economy's neck. So Nixon decided to break the chain. He decided to do something no major power had ever done during peacetime. He decided to default on the world's most important financial promise. He gathered his top advisors at Camp David, a secluded presidential retreat in the Maryland mountains. It was a secret meeting. The world press didn't know it was happening. Nixon's team, including his Treasury Secretary John Connally, debated the options. Traditional economists argued they must save the gold standard. They argued that severing the link to gold would destroy the dollar's credibility. They warned of chaos. But Connally, a tough-talking Texan, famously told the Europeans effectively that the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. He argued for the nuclear option. Close the gold window, stop the shipments, tell France and Britain and the world to accept it. On the evening of Sunday, August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon interrupted the wildly popular television show Bonanza to address the nation. He looked into the camera and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in economic history. He spoke about defending the dollar against international speculators. He blamed faceless financial forces for the crisis. Then, buried in the middle of the speech, he dropped the bombshell. He announced that he had directed the Treasury Secretary to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. He used the word temporarily. It was deceptive. The gold window would never reopen. The Nixon shock, as it became known, was an earthquake. In Paris, the French government was stunned. They had won the argument but lost the war. De Gaulle had died the previous year, but his successors watched in horror as America simply changed the rules. France had wagered that gold was the ultimate currency and that America would be forced to discipline itself to protect its gold reserves. Instead, America simply declared that gold no longer mattered. They declared that the dollar was money simply because America said it was. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Currency markets shut down. Traders didn't know how to price anything. When they reopened, the dollar's value plummeted against the French franc, German mark, and Japanese yen. This meant American goods became cheaper, and foreign goods became more expensive. It was a massive devaluation that hurt Europe and helped American manufacturers. It was exactly what Nixon wanted. But for the French, sitting on piles of gold bars in Paris, it was a bittersweet victory. Yes, they had their gold. And yes, gold's price skyrocketed. In the years following the Nixon shock, gold went from $35 per ounce to over $800 per ounce. The French Treasury made a fortune on paper. De Gaulle's decision to acquire gold appeared to be a stroke of genius. He had traded depreciating paper for an asset that exploded in value. However, de Gaulle's deeper objective had failed. He had wanted to force America to be responsible. He had wanted to return the world to a system of honest money where nations couldn't print their way out of debt. Instead, his attack had forced America to sever the last link to reality. The world moved from a gold standard to a fiat standard. In this new world, America didn't need gold at all. It could print as many dollars as it wanted, and the world had no choice but to accept them because there was no alternative. The dollar remained the world reserve currency, not because it was backed by gold, but because it was backed by American military power and the American economy. The consequences of this shift remain with us today. The inflation of the 1970s was a direct result of this decoupling. Without gold's discipline, governments worldwide began printing money to solve every political problem. The era of stable prices was over. The era of constant inflation had begun. For France, the gold conflict was the last great act of defiance by a European power against American hegemony. It was the last time a Western ally dared to look Washington in the eye and say no. The ships that carried the gold across the Atlantic were the final convoy of an older world, a world where money was physical, where debts had to be paid, and where a promise written on paper was expected to be honored. The legacy of this event is profound. It taught the world that America would always act in its own self-interest, even if it meant breaking its own treaties. It taught developing nations that holding dollar reserves was a risk because the rules could change overnight. And it validated the cynicism of Charles de Gaulle, who always believed that nations have no friends, only interests. In the end, the gold conflict was a battle between two philosophies. The philosophy of gold, represented by France, which valued stability, history, and tangible assets, and the philosophy of the dollar, represented by America, which valued flexibility, growth, and the power of the state to manage the economy. America won the geopolitical battle. The dollar remained supreme. But France won the moral argument. The instability, debt crises, and inflation that have plagued the global economy since 1971 are the direct result of ignoring the warning de Gaulle delivered in that press conference. Today, the gold France repatriated still sits in the deep vaults of the Bank of France in Paris. It is among the largest gold reserves in the world. It sits there as a silent monument to the time when France forced America to pay its debts. It is a reminder of the brief moment when a French president sent his navy to New York, not to conquer territory, but to capture the truth. The ships have long since been scrapped. The politicians are dead. But the gold remains, eternal, unalterable, and indifferent to the paper promises of empires. The gold conflict is over, but the question it asked remains unanswered. What is money really? Is it a promise from a government? Or is it a cold, hard piece of metal that owes nothing to anyone? Charles de Gaulle made his choice, and looking at the mountain of debt the world sits on today, it's difficult to say he was wrong.